Imagine standing outside tonight. No city lights around you, no phone in your hand, no roof above your head. Just darkness. And above you, spreading from one edge of the world to the other, more stars than you could ever count. So many stars that the sky itself looks white in places. A river of light running straight through the middle of everything. Now imagine you have never seen a street lamp, never seen a candle. The only light in the entire world comes from fire, and from up there. This is how every human being who ever lived once stood, looking up, wondering. Your great-great-grandparents, repeated 10,000 times, stood in exactly this spot, on a hillside, or a beach, or the edge of a forest, with their necks tilted back and their eyes wide open. And at some point, something happened, something that changed us forever. Someone noticed a pattern, not just that the stars were beautiful, not just that there were a lot of them, but that they moved, that they returned, that the same bright star appeared every year just before the rains came, that a certain cluster of lights rose at the same moment the antelope herds arrived, that the moon grew and shrank in a rhythm you could count on your fingers, that the sky was not random. The sky was a calendar, a map, a clock, a story, and the moment a human being first understood that, the world became a different place. Here is what almost nobody talks about when they talk about ancient history. We speak about cave paintings, stone tools, the invention of farming. We speak about ancient Egypt and Rome and Greece as if those were the beginning of human intelligence. But those came so late. For 300,000 years before any of that, human beings were already watching the sky, already thinking about it, already building their entire lives around what they saw up there. The first astronomers were not men in towers with telescopes. They were barefoot. They wore animal skins. They had no writing, no math, no schools. But they understood the sky in ways that would astonish modern scientists. And the story of how they got there, how ordinary humans sitting around fires in the dark slowly learned to read the heavens, is one of the most beautiful stories in all of human history. That story is what we are going to tell tonight. So get comfortable. Let your body sink into wherever you are resting, because this is a long, slow, wonderful journey. We are going back to the very beginning, before everything, to the first night a human being looked up and started to understand. And somewhere along the way, you are going to realize something. That person was you. If you are listening to this to help you fall asleep, you are in the right place. That is exactly what this channel is for. If these slow journeys through deep history help you find some peace at the end of your day, consider subscribing so you can find more stories waiting for you whenever you need them. I love reading the comments. People from Sydney to Stockholm to Sao Paulo, all lying in the dark, all listening to the same story. Leave a comment if you like. Tell me where in the world you are tonight. What time is it where you are? Now, let us begin. Part 1. The darkness, before understanding. Before we can understand what it meant to look at the stars and understand them, we have to understand the darkness. Real darkness. Not the dimness of a modern bedroom with a streetlight glowing through the curtains. Real, complete, total darkness. On a moonless night, far from any city, the human eye can see roughly 4,000 stars with no help at all. On a clear night at high altitude, that number climbs closer to 10,000. The ancient Egyptians, who lived in one of the driest, clearest places on Earth, would have seen a sky that modern urban humans almost never see. A sky so thick with stars that navigation was almost automatic. A sky so bright that shadows were visible even at midnight. For most of human history, this was simply the night. People were not amazed by it the way we are amazed now when we occasionally escape the city and see a dark sky for the first time. It was not a special occasion. It was every night. It was as familiar as the ground under your feet. But familiarity does not mean understanding. Your dog sees the moon rise every night. Your cat watches the stars from the windowsill. Familiarity is not the same as comprehension. The shift from seeing the sky to understanding the sky, that took something extraordinary. Something that, as far as we know, only humans ever achieved. It took pattern recognition married to memory, married to communication. Let us start with the simplest thing, the moon. Even a very young child, if they pay attention over several weeks, can notice that the moon changes shape. A tiny sliver one night, a half-circle days later, a full glowing disk, then shrinking again, then gone. Then the sliver returns. This cycle takes 29.5 days, and it is so regular, so reliable, so rhythmic that once you notice it, you never forget it. It becomes the first clock, the first calendar, the oldest way of measuring time that human beings ever found. We know that prehistoric people were counting the moon cycle because we found the evidence in bone. In 1960, a Belgian geologist named Jean de Heinzelin found a small baboon fibula bone in a place called Ishango, on the shore of Lake Edward in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. The bone is about 20,000 years old, and it is covered in notches. Not random scratches, notches in specific groups. 3 groups of marks that, when analyzed carefully, appear to follow lunar cycles. Groups that correspond to the waxing and waning of the moon over several months. Someone sat by a lake 20,000 years ago and carved the movement of the moon into a bone. They were keeping track. Think about what that means for a moment. Not just noticing the moon, not just appreciating how beautiful it looked on the water, but deciding to record its movements, deciding that this information was worth preserving, deciding that the pattern mattered. That is science. That is the beginning of astronomy. But the Ishango bone is not even the oldest. The Lebombo bone, found in a cave in the Lebombo Mountains between South Africa and Eswatini, is at least 43,000 years old, possibly older. It is also a small bone, also covered in notches, 29 marks in a row. The exact number of days in one lunar month. 43,000 years ago, someone was counting the moon. And here is the thing that gives you chills when you really think about it. 43,000 years ago is before Homo sapiens had even reached Europe, before the cave paintings, before any of the things we usually point to as evidence of sophisticated human thought. The first astronomers were older than we ever imagined. Part 2. What the stars could tell you now. Imagine you are not a scientist. You are not interested in astronomy as a subject. You are interested in staying alive. You are part of a small group of people, maybe 25 individuals, maybe 30. You move across a landscape that is vast and unpredictable. You follow the rains. You follow the animals. You follow the plants. And every year the same questions return. When will the rains come? Where will the herds be? When do the fish spawn in the river? When should we begin moving north? When should we head back south? These are not abstract questions. Get the timing wrong and people starve. Get the timing right and the whole group survives another year. Now imagine that you slowly begin to notice something. A particular star, bright and reddish, always appears on the eastern horizon just a few weeks before the rains begin. Every year, without fail, the star shows up. The rains follow. You do not know why. You do not have a theory of planetary motion. You have no idea that what you are observing is Earth's movement around the sun changing which stars are visible at dawn. You only know what you see. The red star rises. The rains come. And that knowledge is worth more than gold. This is exactly how ancient peoples around the world used the stars. Not as decoration, not as mythology, though mythology came later, but as a practical tool for surviving in a world with no other calendars. The Mursi people of Ethiopia still use the heliacal rising of certain stars to time their agricultural calendar. The heliacal rising is when a star first becomes visible just before sunrise, after a period of invisibility. Different stars have their heliacal rising at different times of year, and because the sky is so consistent, those risings happen at almost exactly the same time every year. Ancient farmers and herders learned this. Learned which star's return meant which season was coming. The Pleiades, that small tight cluster of stars that looks like a tiny smudge of light in the constellation Taurus, appear in the evening sky in spring in the northern hemisphere. Cultures from Greece to Aboriginal Australia to the Andean highlands all used the Pleiades to time their planting seasons. All of them independently. All of them arriving at the same conclusion. When the seven sisters appear, it is time to plant. The Egyptians watched a different star, Sirius. Sirius is the brightest star in the night sky. It is so bright it almost seems to pulse, to vibrate with its own energy. And the ancient Egyptians noticed something extraordinary about it. Every year, after a period of invisibility, Sirius rose again just before dawn, at almost exactly the same time the Nile began to flood. The flood was everything. It was the source of the fertile soil that made Egyptian civilization possible. Without it, there was no food. Without the flood, Egypt did not exist. And here was this great star, appearing like a signal, an announcement. The flood is coming. Prepare. The ancient Egyptians called Sirius Sopdet. They gave it a goddess form. They built temples aligned so that on the day of its heliacal rising, the first light of dawn would shine through the temple doorway directly onto the altar. They were celebrating a star because the star had saved their lives every year for thousands of years. This is something important to hold on to as we go deeper into this story. For ancient peoples, the stars were not separate from daily life. They were daily life. Part 3. The people who remembered here is a question that archaeologists argue about constantly. If ancient humans were so sophisticated about the sky, why did it take so long for written astronomy to appear? Why is the first formal astronomical text only about 5,000 years old, while we have evidence of astronomical awareness going back 50,000 years? The answer is beautiful in its simplicity. They did not need to write it down, because they had something better. They had stories. In cultures without writing, information does not disappear when people die. It transforms. It becomes myth. It becomes legend. It becomes a story that gets told around the fire every generation, that children memorize before they can even understand what they are hearing, that adults refine and pass on like a living document that never stops updating itself. The Aboriginal Australians have a tradition of oral astronomical knowledge that researchers have only recently begun to take seriously. And what they found when they did was astonishing. Some Aboriginal stories contain accurate astronomical information about events that happened more than 10,000 years ago. Researchers studying coastal flooding stories from Aboriginal communities found tales that described coastlines being swallowed by the sea, islands that used to be connected to the mainland, specific harbours that no longer exist. When they checked these stories against geological records, they matched. The stories described flooding events from the end of the last ice age, events that happened 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. The stories had been accurately preserved for 10,000 years, passed from parent to child, from elder to young person, across hundreds of generations, without losing their essential truth. Now, think about astronomical knowledge in that context. If a community knows that a certain star cluster rising means the salmon are running, and if they tell that as a story, as part of their cosmology, as part of who they are, that knowledge can survive for an unimaginably long time. The Aboriginal Australians have stories about the Pleiades being chased by the stars of Orion, beautiful, poetic stories about a group of 7 sisters being pursued across the sky. These stories explain the movement of those stars across the seasons. They encode real astronomical information in a narrative that is easy to remember, emotionally resonant, and culturally significant. Children learn the story. They learn the emotions of it. They learn the images. And quietly, without ever realizing it, they also learn when the Pleiades rise and set, and what that means for the seasons. The story is the database. This is how most of human astronomical knowledge was stored for the vast majority of our history. Not in clay tablets, not in papyrus scrolls, in stories told around fires, under the very sky they were describing. And here is what stops you cold when you really sit with it. We have lost most of it. When colonial powers arrived in Australia, in the Americas, in Africa, in the Pacific Islands, they did not just take land. They disrupted the transmission of knowledge. Elders died before they could pass their stories on. Children were taken from their communities and prevented from learning the old ways. Languages were suppressed, ceremonies were banned. We will never know how much astronomical knowledge was carried in those lost languages, those silenced elders, those interrupted stories. The sky they read is still up there, but we have lost many of the books that explained it. Part 4. Monuments that told time. But some of that ancient knowledge was preserved in a different way. Not in words, not in bone, but in stone. Around the world, in places as different as the Irish countryside, the Peruvian highlands, the Egyptian desert, and the Cambodian jungle, ancient peoples built structures that were aligned with the sky. Precisely aligned. Aligned in ways that required decades of observation, careful planning, sophisticated understanding of how the sky moved, and enormous physical effort. The most famous of these is Stonehenge. Stonehenge stands on Salisbury Plain in southern England. It was built in stages over a period of 1,500 years, beginning around 5,000 years ago. The largest stones, the sarsen stones, weigh up to 25 tons. They were transported from a quarry 25 miles away. The smaller bluestones came from Wales, more than 200 miles distant. Moving those stones was an enormous undertaking for people with no wheels, no iron, no horses. They used wooden sledges, ropes made from plant fibers, and sheer human effort. Hundreds of people working together over years to bring a single stone to its destination. Why? Because on the morning of the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, the sun rises in exact alignment with the heel-stone, and the first light of dawn shines directly through the main entrance of the monument. The builders knew exactly where the sun would rise on that specific morning. They oriented their entire monument around that single moment, and they moved 200-mile stones to make it happen. They cared that much about marking the moment. But Stonehenge is actually a relative newcomer in the world of astronomical monuments. In the Egyptian Sahara, near a place called Nabta Playa, there is a stone circle that is at least 7,000 years old, possibly older. The stones in this circle are aligned with the summer solstice sunrise. Some of them appear to be aligned with specific bright stars. This site was built by pastoral nomads, herders who moved with the rains across the Sahara, at a time when the Sahara was green and wet, thousands of years before Egypt became a civilization. These were not farmers with settled cities. They were moving people, people who packed up and left when the seasons changed. But they still built a stone circle aligned to the sky. Still felt it was worth the effort. Still felt that marking the solstice, anchoring themselves to the turning of the year, was important enough to move heavy stones in the desert. Even further back, in Göbekli Tepe, in what is now Turkey, we find pillars carved with animals and abstract symbols, arranged in circular enclosures, some of which appear to be aligned with stars that were rising at specific times when the structure was built, around 11,000 years ago. This is the oldest monumental architecture we have ever found. Older than farming, older than any city, older than writing by 6,000 years. And it points at the sky. When the first architects humanity ever produced decided to build something that would last, they built it to mark the movement of the heavens. What does that tell you about what mattered most to them? Part 5. The night sky as a living being. Let your body relax a little more now. Take a slow breath, because this part of the story is the most beautiful. For ancient peoples, the stars were not distant balls of nuclear fire. They were not objects to be measured and classified. They were alive. They were persons. They were part of a community that included humans, animals, plants, water, wind, and the luminous things above. This way of understanding the world is called animism. It means seeing the world as full of living presences, full of relationships, full of meaning. And before you think of it as primitive or naive, consider this. Modern physicists now describe the universe as something closer to a process than a collection of objects. A continuous dynamic becoming in which nothing is truly separate from anything else, in which the observer affects the observed, in which matter and energy are different aspects of the same underlying reality. The ancient person watching a star and saying, "That star is alive, that star cares about us, that star has a relationship with us," was perhaps more right than wrong. Just using different language, the Lakota people of North America speak of the Milky Way as Wanagi Tachanku, the spirit road, the path taken by the souls of the dead on their journey to the next world. When you die, your spirit follows that great river of light across the sky. The ancient Egyptians believed the Milky Way was the body of the goddess Nut, who arched herself across the sky every night to protect the world, giving birth to the sun each morning. The Greek word for the Milky Way means exactly that, milky, because they believed it was the trail of milk spilled when the infant Heracles suckled at the breast of the goddess Hera and was torn away. Different stories, but all of them doing the same thing, taking this overwhelming feature of the night sky and weaving it into a story that connected humans to the cosmos, made the sky personal, made it meaningful, made the darkness feel less lonely. And here is what is remarkable about so many of these sky stories. Even though they come from cultures that never met each other, cultures separated by oceans and continents and thousands of years, they share certain themes again and again. The stars as the souls of the dead, the sky as a great body, the planets as divine messengers, the sun as a being that must be welcomed each morning and thanked each evening. Maybe these themes persist because the sky presents the same images to all human eyes. Or maybe there is something in the human mind that naturally reaches for certain meanings when it encounters the darkness above. Whatever the reason, something in us wants the sky to be inhabited, wants to feel that we are not alone under it, and that wanting, that deep reaching toward the lights above, that is part of what drove ancient humans to study the sky more and more carefully. Not just to use it, but to know it, to be in relationship with it. Part 6. The great turning here is something that takes a moment to sink in. The night sky is not the same tonight as it was 10,000 years ago. Not because the stars themselves have changed, though actually over very long timescales they do move slightly, but because of something called axial precession. Earth wobbles, very slowly. Like a spinning top that is just beginning to slow down, Earth's axis traces a slow circle in space. A full circle takes about 26,000 years. Because of this wobble, the position of the celestial poles shifts over centuries. The North Star today, Polaris, was not the North Star in ancient Egypt. It will not be the North Star in 3,000 years. And the stars that rise at dawn on any given day of the year also shift slowly over millennia. This means that when an ancient Egyptian temple was built to align with Sirius rising at the moment of the Nile flood, that alignment was accurate for that era. Over centuries, it drifted. Some temples had to be realigned multiple times as the precession shifted the sky. The ancient builders noticed this. Some researchers believe that the great circular structures at Stonehenge and similar sites were designed with this slow drift in mind, that they were updated over generations as the sky shifted, that each addition to Stonehenge, each new set of stones, arranged or rearranged, was a correction for the slow turning of the heavens. If that is true, it means Stonehenge was not just a monument. It was a scientific instrument being continuously updated over 1,500 years by people who had no books, no universities, no formal education. Just eyes, memory, careful observation, and the willingness to correct themselves when the evidence said they were wrong. That is the scientific method, applied to the sky, 5,000 years ago. Part 7. The people who became specialists. Every group of humans in every part of the world eventually developed certain individuals who specialized in reading the sky. We give them many names: priests, shamans, diviners, sky watchers, wise women, stargazers. but their function was similar across cultures. They were the memory holders, the pattern keepers, the people who spent their entire lives learning what the sky was telling them. In Babylon, what is now Iraq, the first formal astronomical texts appear around 4,000 years ago. But the knowledge recorded in those texts was clearly much older, accumulated across generations before anyone thought to write it down. The Babylonian astronomers could predict lunar eclipses. They tracked the movements of Venus with remarkable accuracy. They mapped the path of the moon across the sky, identifying the 12 zones we still call the zodiac today. Their records were cuneiform marks on clay tablets. Thousands of tablets have survived. When modern astronomers analyze the data recorded on those tablets, they find it is astonishingly accurate. Not perfect, but sophisticated. The result of centuries of careful observation, patient record-keeping, and mathematical thinking by people who were doing this for deeply practical reasons. Predicting eclipses was not just an intellectual puzzle. An eclipse meant something was happening with the divine forces that govern the world. A king needed to know if an eclipse was coming so he could prepare ritually, so he could make the right sacrifices, so he could protect his kingdom from whatever omen the sky was delivering. The astronomical knowledge and the religious interpretation were inseparable. To study the sky was to study the will of the gods. To predict what the sky would do was to give kings and communities power over their fate. But quietly, underneath all that religious context, the methodology was scientific. Observe, record, find the pattern, use the pattern to predict, check the prediction against reality, refine the model. The Babylonian astronomers were doing this 1,000 years before anyone in Greece began to formalize the rules of scientific thinking. In China, the royal astronomers of the Shang dynasty, who lived around 3,500 years ago, were required to observe the sky every single night and record what they saw. The emperor needed to know if any unusual phenomenon occurred. A comet, an unusually bright star, an eclipse. Any deviation from the normal pattern could be a divine message requiring response. We have oracle bones from that era with astronomical observations scratched into them, descriptions of solar eclipses, records of what appear to be supernovae. The earliest known observation of a solar eclipse in the Chinese records dates to around 1200 BCE. But the tradition is older than those records. The court astronomers of China in the Shang dynasty were inheriting a tradition of sky watching that stretched back far before their civilization existed. In Mesoamerica, the Maya developed one of the most extraordinary astronomical traditions the world has ever seen. Without telescopes, without modern mathematics in the form we would recognize. Using only naked eye observation, careful record-keeping, and generations of accumulated knowledge, the Maya calculated the length of the solar year to an accuracy that rivals modern measurements. They tracked the cycle of Venus with such precision that their Venus tables in the Dresden Codex, a surviving Maya book, predict the risings and settings of Venus with errors of only a few minutes over a 5-year period. A few minutes. Over 5 years. Without a single modern instrument. They also tracked the cycles of Mars and Jupiter. They identified the pattern of solar eclipses, known as the Saros cycle, with stunning accuracy. They developed a system of interlocking calendars, including a 260-day ritual calendar and a 365-day solar calendar that meshed together in a pattern that only repeated every 52 years. The Maya were not just reading the sky for planting seasons. They were building an entire cosmology around it. A philosophy of time in which the movements of heavenly bodies revealed the structure of reality itself, in which human history and cosmic history were the same story, and all of this built on generation after generation of patient watching. Part 8. The night the comet came. But not everything in the sky was predictable. Sometimes the sky sent something new. Imagine living in a world where the stars are so familiar you know them the way you know the faces of your family, where you could tell at a glance if anything was out of place, where any deviation from the expected pattern was immediately noticed and immediately significant. Now imagine a light appears in the sky that was not there yesterday. Not a familiar planet moving along its expected path. Not a meteor that flashes and vanishes in a second. But a new light, a bright one. One that grows over nights and weeks, that develops a long trailing brightness behind it, like a torch being carried across the heavens, that hangs in the sky for weeks or months before slowly fading. A comet. The first time an ancient person saw a bright comet must have been one of the most alarming experiences imaginable. Everything about comets violated the rules. The sky was supposed to be orderly, predictable, trustworthy. The stars returned to the same places every year. The sun and moon followed their known paths. Everything had its rhythm. And then here came this thing. This bright wandering fire, moving slowly but visibly, growing, trailing light. It did not follow any known rule, and because ancient peoples understood the sky as a living, communicating, meaningful system, a comet was not just a curiosity, it was a message. What kind of message depended on the culture and the era. The ancient Chinese recorded comets with careful detail. They described their shapes, their colors, their positions, their apparent paths. They called them broom stars and hair stars. And in their records, comets were almost always ominous. They foretold war, famine, the death of kings, the fall of dynasties. Not because the comets caused those things, but because in a world where the sky was a reflection of heavenly will, an unexpected appearance in the sky meant that something unexpected was happening in the divine realm too. The Romans feared comets so strongly that when a comet appeared in 44 BCE, in the weeks after Julius Caesar was assassinated, his heir Octavian, who would later become Augustus, declared that it was the soul of Caesar ascending to heaven. It became known as the Sidus Julium, the Julian star. Whether Octavian believed this or was using it politically, we cannot know. Probably both. But the broader Roman population, who had grown up understanding the sky as a theatre of divine communication, were deeply affected by the sight. The comet justified Caesar's deification. It became one of the most significant astronomical events in Roman political history. And none of this would have been possible if people had not been paying attention to the sky for so long. If the comet had not been immediately obvious as something outside the normal order. If generations of watching had not made the normal sky so deeply familiar that the abnormal leapt out. The sensitivity to change, the ability to notice what did not belong, that was built over thousands of years of careful sky watching. Part 9. When the stars moved Earth. let us come back down for a moment, from the grand sweep of history to something smaller, more intimate, a single night, somewhere in North Africa, maybe 40,000 years ago. A person is lying on their back on warm stone. The fire behind them has burned low. The camp is quiet. Children are asleep. The day's work is done. They are looking up, not for any particular reason, not doing astronomy, just lying there in the way humans have always lain outside on warm nights, looking at the sky because it is there, because it is beautiful, because there is nothing else to do in the hours before sleep comes. And something happens. Maybe it is just the overwhelming scale of it, the sense which anyone who has been under a truly dark sky has felt, that the sky is not flat but deep, that it recedes away from you in all directions, that you are not looking at a ceiling but through a window of impossible depth, a depth that goes on so far it breaks something in your normal way of understanding space. That feeling of smallness. And paradoxically, that feeling of belonging. Because however small you are part of this. You are made of the same material as those lights. The same atoms that burn in distant suns burn in your body right now. We know that now. They did not know that then, but they felt something like it. There is evidence in cave art from across the world that ancient humans tried to capture the sky in their art. The famous cave paintings at Lascaux in France include a grouping of dots above a painted bull that some researchers believe represents the Pleiades. If they are right, then those 6 dots were painted 17,000 years ago by someone who was trying to put the sky and the earth in the same image, to connect them. The Lascaux Hall of the Bulls also contains a representation of what may be the constellation Taurus, with what may be the Pleiades and the Hyades star clusters accurately depicted. If this interpretation is correct, and scholars argue about it, then the cave painters were not just documenting the animals they hunted. They were documenting the sky those animals moved under. They were placing the animals in cosmic context. That is not survival behavior. That is philosophy. That is the impulse to say, here is the world I live in. And it is not just the ground under my feet, but also the sky above my head. And everything is connected. That impulse is in us still. Part 10. Reading the sky from the ground. Now here is something that surprises people when they first hear it. Ancient sky watching was intensely physical. We imagine the ancient astronomer as someone standing still, looking up. Passive, receptive. But actually, for people before writing, before instruments, before any way to record what they saw except memory and story and stone, the only way to understand the sky was to live with it, completely, for years. You learned the sky the way you learned the landscape, not by studying it from a distance, but by walking in it, watching it, feeling it change around you through every season, through every year, through the whole span of your life. A good sky watcher in any ancient community would have started learning as a child, would have had an elder who pointed out the stars and told the stories and said, "Watch that one. In 3 more nights it will be there instead of there." The elder was not teaching a class. They were sharing something they loved, something they had spent decades learning to love. The child lay on their back and watched, night after night, year after year, and gradually the sky became legible. You know how it feels to walk into a room where you know everyone, where you recognize each face, know each person's habits, can tell at a glance who is in a good mood and who is not. That is what the night sky looked like to a skilled ancient sky watcher, full of familiar presences, each one with its own character, its own movement, its own seasonal story. Modern astronomers talk about this too. Professional astronomers and dedicated amateurs both describe a moment in their development when the sky stopped being a jumble of random points and became a coherent system, when they began to see the patterns, when they began to feel at home. For ancient peoples who had no alternative, who learned the sky before they could read, who lived outside in all weather, who never had a roof between themselves and the stars for their entire childhood, that fluency would have come early and run deep. The sky was their mother tongue. Part 11. The Mathematics Hidden in Plain Sight. Here is something that used to be controversial in archaeology. Now it is increasingly accepted. Ancient people did mathematics, not in the formal way we think of math. No equations written on a page, no abstract symbols, but the thing that mathematics actually is, which is noticing quantitative patterns in reality and using them to make predictions, that they absolutely did. The Ishango bone, with its lunar notches, is one example. But there are others. The stone circles of Britain and Ireland, Stonehenge being the most famous but far from the only one, show evidence of deliberate geometric planning. The circles are not quite circles, they are precise ellipses and egg shapes, some of them laid out with pegs and ropes using Pythagorean triangles to create specific proportional relationships. The Pythagorean theorem, codified in Greece around 500 BCE, but apparently used to lay out stone circles in Britain 2,000 years earlier. How? Nobody told the Bronze Age builders about the Pythagorean theorem. No Greek philosopher came to Wiltshire to teach them. They discovered it themselves. Practically, by laying out ropes and pegs on the ground and discovering that certain length relationships produced right angles. That if you had a triangle with sides in a 3-4-5 ratio, the corner opposite the longest side was perfectly square. They discovered this through hands-on experimentation, through the practical work of trying to build circular enclosures that were geometrically precise, through trial and error and the accumulation of practical knowledge over generations of builders. They did not know they were doing mathematics. They just knew what worked. But what worked was mathematics. The same is true of astronomy. The Babylonians who developed tables predicting planetary positions were doing a kind of applied mathematics. They found patterns in the numbers. They used those patterns to build arithmetic models that could generate predictions. They were doing what we would now call regression analysis, finding the underlying mathematical structure in observational data. Again, they did not know they were doing mathematics in any formal sense. They were doing something practical, trying to figure out where Venus would be in 40 years. But the method was mathematical, and it worked because the universe actually is mathematical, because there are real patterns in the movements of the sky, because the regularities that ancient peoples noticed were real regularities, not imagined ones. Their sky stories may have been poetic, but they were pointing at something real. Part 12. The stars that guided the voyage. We should spend some time on the Pacific Ocean, because what happened in the Pacific Ocean is perhaps the most extraordinary story of practical astronomy in all of human history. Beginning around 3,500 years ago and continuing until about 1,000 years ago, human beings colonized the Pacific Islands. Not just the islands near the coast of Asia, not just the places you could see from shore, but the deep Pacific, Hawaii, Easter Island, New Zealand, the Marquesas, the Tuamotus, the Society Islands. These islands are so remote, so separated from each other by thousands of miles of open ocean, that for a long time Western scholars refused to believe they had been deliberately colonized. They assumed the Polynesian people must have arrived by accident, blown off course, lucky survivors of storms. This was wrong. And it was wrong in a way that says something uncomfortable about how Western scholars thought about non-Western peoples. The Polynesians were master navigators. They crossed thousands of miles of open ocean in deliberately constructed double-hulled canoes. They brought with them plants, animals, and everything needed to establish a new community. They returned home afterward. They made multiple voyages to the same destinations. And they did all of this using the stars. Traditional Polynesian wayfinding uses a mental model called the star compass. The navigator memorizes the rising and setting points of hundreds of stars, the way the stars arc across the sky throughout the night, and the direction each star provides at different times. They also memorize the feel of ocean swells, the behavior of clouds near islands, the patterns of birds, the color of the water, and many other natural signs. A master navigator could position themselves in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, hundreds of miles from any land, with no instruments whatsoever, and know exactly where they were, and exactly how to get where they were going. This knowledge took years to acquire. It was taught through apprenticeship, through poems and songs and chants that encoded the information in memorable form, through actual voyages where the student learned under conditions where getting it wrong meant death. The knowledge was so demanding and so important that navigators were among the most respected members of their societies. The Mau Piailug of Satawal, one of the last master navigators of the traditional school, who taught the Polynesian Voyaging Society in the 1970s how to sail from Hawaii to Tahiti without instruments, said that the sea and the sky were not things he studied. They were things he was part of. The boundary between himself and the navigational environment had dissolved through years of immersion. He was not reading the sky, he was living inside it. That is the end point of a long, long journey that began with the first person who noticed that a certain star always returned at the same time each year. Part 13. The Living Sky. We are coming toward the end of this journey. Let the weight of your body sink a little more. Let your breathing slow. There is something important to notice about everything we have talked about tonight. The ancient relationship with the sky was not passive. It was not the relationship of a viewer and a screen. It was participatory. It was reciprocal. It was a relationship in the fullest sense. When an ancient Egyptian priest stood before the opening of a temple as Sirius rose on the eastern horizon in the pre-dawn darkness, he was not an observer. He was a participant in something that the sky was doing, and that he was doing with the sky. The alignment of the temple meant that the light of Sirius literally entered the sacred space, touched the altar, completed a connection that the builders had designed to happen at that moment. The star and the human were in relationship. When a Polynesian navigator lay on the deck of his canoe at night, letting the movement of ocean swells travel through his body while he watched the stars rotate overhead. He was not calculating. He was communing. He was using his whole self, body and mind and memory, as an instrument tuned to the world around him. When a Lakota grandmother pointed out the spirit road to her grandchild on a clear winter night and said, "That is where we go when we leave this world," she was not teaching mythology separate from astronomy. She was teaching her grandchild their place in the universe. She was showing them that the cosmos has a place for each of us, even after death. She was giving them comfort and meaning wrapped up in the actual shape of the actual sky. This is what the stars were for most of human history. Not distant objects to be measured, not data points to be catalogued, but companions, guides, teachers, the always present reminder that the world is larger and older and more ordered than any individual life, and also more intimate, because those stars were familiar, named, storied, known. The modern mirror. We have to be honest about something here. Most of us have lost this, not because we became smarter than our ancestors. We did not. The people we have been talking about tonight were fully modern humans, with the same brains, the same cognitive capacity, the same depth of emotion and thought. They were not primitive. They were us, living in different circumstances. We have lost the sky because we covered it with light. The International Dark Sky Association estimates that 80% of people in North America and Europe cannot see the Milky Way from where they live. The light pollution from our cities has dimmed the sky so thoroughly that the great river of light that was the backdrop of every human night for 300,000 years is simply gone from most people's experience. We have also lost it because we moved inside, because we sleep in rooms with roofs, because we commute in vehicles, because our evenings are illuminated, heated, screened. There is nothing inherently wrong with any of this. Warmth and light and shelter are genuinely good things. But something was lost. Something real. The sense of being embedded in the cosmos. The constant nightly reminder of your smallness and belonging. The live connection to a sky that was giving you information about seasons, about navigation, about time, about meaning. Your nervous system was shaped by 300,000 years of looking at the dark sky. The sky was part of your daily experience for an incomprehensible length of time, and now it is gone from most lives. Maybe that contributes to the feeling that many modern people have, that feeling of floating without anchor, of having lost some orientation that they cannot quite name. A sense that something important is missing, but they cannot point to what it is. Maybe part of what is missing is above our heads. And here is the small practical wonder of this. All you have to do to recover a piece of it is go outside on a clear night, away from lights, and look up. The sky your ancestors learned is still there. The Pleiades rise in the same place. Orion still strides across the winter sky. The Milky Way still arches from horizon to horizon on moonless nights away from cities. The stars are waiting. They have been waiting for you your whole life. And somewhere in the back of your mind, in the part of you that is older than language, you already know them. Sleep transition. Come back now to where you are, your room, your bed, the weight of your body exactly where it is. Outside your window or above your roof, the same stars are turning that have turned above every human life since the very first human life. The same Milky Way that ancient Egyptians called the body of a goddess. that the Lakota called the Road of Souls, that Polynesian navigators memorized down to the last rising point, is out there right now. It does not matter if you can see it from where you are. It is there. And you are made of the same material as every light in it, the same atoms, forged in the same ancient stellar furnaces, scattered into space across billions of years, eventually becoming you lying here right now, breathing slowly. The first person who looked up and understood that a pattern was there, they looked up and saw something that connected them to everything, to the rhythms larger than any human life, to the turning of something vast and reliable and ancient. That same connection is still available to you. It is in the body you inhabit. It is in the nervous system that calms when you are outside under open sky. It is in the part of you that still feels, even if you have never studied astronomy, and even if you live in a city, and even if you have not seen a truly dark sky in years, that there is something up there worth paying attention to. Your ancestors spent hundreds of thousands of years building a relationship with the sky. That relationship is part of what you are. The people who counted the moon on a bone 43,000 years ago, they were your family. The navigator lying on the deck of his canoe, feeling the stars wheel overhead, he was your cousin. 10,000 generations back. The grandmother who pointed to the Milky Way and said, "That is where we go," she was talking to a child whose descendants eventually became you. You carry all of that with you into sleep tonight. The same moon that hung over the first person who understood its cycle is outside right now. You do not need to go look. You already know it is there. Let your eyes close. Let the weight of everything from today become less important. The sky is doing what it has always done, turning slowly. Stars rising in the east, crossing, setting in the west. The same reliable ancient motion. You do not need to watch it tonight. You do not need to track it or understand it or do anything with it. You can just rest, knowing that it is there, knowing that you are part of something that has been going on for a very, very long time. Long before cities, long before farming, long before anyone wrote anything down or built anything in stone, there was a sky, and under it a person looking up and finding something there that made the dark feel less frightening. That same something is still there, and you are still that person. Rest now. The stars will be there in the morning. They always are.